The notice had been taped to their door on a Tuesday, which Nora always thought was a cruel day for bad news. Not a Monday, when you're already bracing for something. Not a Friday, when at least the week is ending. A Tuesday, the kind of day that has nowhere to put its grief. She was 22 and her brother Eli was 20. And they had been living in apartment 4C on Garfield Street for 3 years, ever since their mother died and left them with a small savings account, a storage unit full of furniture, and the particular silence that follows a person out of a room long after they're gone. The notice said they had 30 days. The building had been sold to a development company. Everyone was out. Not just them. Every tenant, all 14 units, gone. But Nora had learned by then that knowing others share your misfortune doesn't actually make it lighter. You still carry your own weight. She stood in the kitchen that morning holding the notice against her chest like it might disappear if she pressed it hard enough. The coffee maker was running. The window above the sink was fogged from the warmth inside. She could see Eli's jacket hanging by the door, his sneakers placed neatly beneath it, the way he always left them, toes forward, heels together, a habit from childhood she'd never had the heart to ask about. He came out of his room rubbing his eyes, wearing an old college sweatshirt 3 sizes too big, and saw her face before he saw the paper. "What happened?" She set it on the counter between them. He read it once. Then again. Then he poured himself coffee without saying anything. And they stood there in this small warm kitchen while the city outside went on being indifferent, and morning came through the fogged window in flat gray light. 30 days, he said finally. Yeah. Okay. That was Eli. Not dramatic, not loud. He processed things the way deep water absorbs stones, quietly, completely, without a ripple on the surface. It used to frustrate her when they were younger. Now she found it steadying. They had some money. Not enough for the apartments in the listings they'd been bookmarking anxiously since rents had started climbing. Not enough for first, last, and deposit in the city. Not enough for what they needed. But maybe, Nora thought, looking at the window, at the fog dissolving at its edges, as the sun finally showed itself, maybe enough for something else. She didn't know yet what that something else would look like. She didn't know that it had already been waiting. That it had been waiting, in fact, for years. That someone, long before this Tuesday, had seen this moment coming, or something like it, and had quietly made a decision that Nora and Eli were only now about to discover. She just stood in the kitchen, holding her coffee, watching the morning. Their mother's name was Claire, and she had been the kind of woman who kept things. Not obsessively, not in the way of people who can't let go, but deliberately, as if she understood that certain objects carry weight that words can't hold. She kept birthday cards in a shoebox under her bed. She kept Eli's first drawing, a crooked purple house with a sun that had too many rays, folded inside a cookbook she never used. She kept Nora's hospital bracelet from the day she was born. After she died, pancreatic cancer, fast and unfair. 6 months from diagnosis to the last breath, Nora had taken the shoebox and the cookbook and the bracelet and everything else that still smelled like her mother, and put it all in the storage unit on Clement Street. Because she couldn't bear to go through it, and she couldn't bear to throw it away. The unit had a rolling metal door and a combination lock, and she paid $50 a month to keep it closed. She and Eli visited once, in the first year, and stood at the entrance looking at the shapes of furniture under sheets. The boxes stacked in order because Claire had labeled them in her careful handwriting, and then they pulled the door back down and didn't go again. In the weeks after the notice, while Nora scrolled through rental listings and Eli picked up extra shifts at the restaurant where he worked, she found herself thinking about the storage unit more than usual. Something kept pulling at her. Not grief exactly, but a kind of itch behind memory, a sense that she'd walked past something without seeing it. One night, she took the bus to Clement Street alone. It was raining lightly, the kind of rain that doesn't bother to fall hard, just hangs in the air and gets into everything. She unlocked the unit and lifted the door and stood at the edge of the light. The boxes were still labeled in her mother's handwriting. Kitchen, books, winter, office, and then, near the back, one she didn't remember noticing before. Or maybe she had noticed it and dismissed it. It was smaller than the others, and labeled simply, "For later." She brought it home on the bus, holding it on her lap like something fragile. Inside she found three things. A folder of documents, property records, she saw when she opened it, though she didn't read them carefully that night. A photograph of a house she didn't recognize, a two-story wooden structure at the edge of what looked like a forest, green and deep behind it, and a sealed envelope with her name and Eli's written on the front in their mother's hand. Not Claire's kids. Not the kids. Their names. Both of them. Together. She set everything on the kitchen table and called Eli. He came out of his room and sat across from her and looked at the envelope for a long time before either of them touched it. "Did you know about this?" he asked. "No." He nodded. He reached out and turned the photograph over. On the back, in their mother's writing, the Alderman property. Heron County. Bought 2019. Nora looked at him. "She bought a house?" He looked back at her. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then he said, quietly, "Open the envelope." The letter was 2 pages, handwritten, dated 8 months before their mother died. Not from the hospital. From the apartment on Garfield Street, where she had sat at the kitchen table, the same table, Nora realized, where she and Eli were sitting now, and written to them as if she could see the future. "I don't know when you'll read this," she had written. "Maybe never. Maybe I'll recover and come get this box myself and feel embarrassed that I was so dramatic. But I don't think so. I think I know how this goes." She explained it plainly, not mournfully, which was so like her. A property in Heron County, about 2 hours north. She had found it through an estate listing 3 years earlier, a family land sale, forested acreage with an old house on it. Priced low because it needed work and because nobody had been in it for years. She had used almost all of what was left of their father's life insurance, the money she'd been holding on to and never spent, and she'd bought it. She hadn't told them. She hadn't wanted to explain. She hadn't been sure back then that it was the right decision. And she'd been afraid that saying it out loud would make it feel like giving up, like she already believed she wasn't going to be there to help them through their 20s. "But I think I did believe that," she'd written. "And I think I wanted you to have somewhere to land." The property documents were all in the folder: deed, county registration, tax records showing 3 years of payments made on time. The house was theirs. Had been theirs, technically, since she'd added their names to the deed in the final months. They drove up on a Saturday in October, Eli's old car loaded with what they could fit from the apartment, most of their things still in boxes in the storage unit. The drive took them through the city's slow dissolve into suburbs, then into a long corridor of highway flanked by hills. Then finally onto county roads, where the trees came in close, and the sky went wide, and the air smelled different, cold and green and old. Nora held the photograph in her lap and watched the woods pass. The road to the Alderman property turned off a 2-lane county route and ran a 1/4 mile through forest before the house appeared. It sat in a clearing at the tree-lined 2 stories, wooden siding gray from weather, a front porch with a railing that had separated from its post on one side. The windows were intact, which Nora had worried about. The roof looked sound from the road. Eli pulled the car to a stop, and they sat looking at it through the windshield. "She bought this," he said. "She did? For us?" "Yeah." He didn't say anything else. He got out of the car and stood in the driveway with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking up at the house, and Nora watched him for a moment before she got out too. The wind moved through the trees behind the house, a long, low sound, not threatening, more like exhaling. The front door key was in the folder, in a small paper envelope their mother had stapled to the inside cover. Nora held it in her palm, small and dull brass, before she put it in the lock. The door opened into a hallway that smelled like wood and old paper, and something sweet and faint that she couldn't name. Cold, but not damp. The floors were oak, darkened with age, solid under her feet. They walked through room by room in silence. Kitchen with old iron fixtures, and a wide window over the sink looking out at the trees. Living room with a stone fireplace. A staircase with a carved banister. Upstairs, 2 bedrooms and a small room that might have been a study, full of late afternoon light. A bathroom with black and white tile, cracked in one corner. It was not beautiful. It was not finished. It needed work in every room. But it stood. It had been standing, Nora thought, through the years they'd needed it most, standing here quietly while they didn't even know it existed. That was the thought that stayed with her as they walked back downstairs. The house had been waiting, and they hadn't known to look. They moved in the following weekend. They didn't discuss it as a serious decision so much as arrive at it the way you arrive at the only door in a hallway, not because you chose it over other options, but because it was what was there. The heating worked, barely, and the water ran after Eli replaced a corroded valve under the kitchen sink. They ordered a cord of wood from a local yard and stacked it against the side of the house, where the previous owners had left an awning standing. Nora bought a basic toolkit and started working through the smallest repairs first, tightening hinges, filling gaps in window frames with weather-stripped foam, screwing the porch railing back into its post. She worked slowly and deliberately, and she found that physical work quieted things in her that had been loud for months. The noise of the notice, the noise of packing, the noise of not knowing what came next. Sanding a door frame in the morning, with the trees outside doing whatever trees do in October wind, she felt something approaching still. Eli drove to town for supplies and came back with groceries and odd pieces of information about the county, who had run the hardware store for 40 years, which diner had the best coffee. The fact that the Alderman family had been known in this area for generations before the property went to estate sale. The old man, people said, had lived alone in the house for the last 20 years after his wife died. No children. So nobody inherited it, Eli said one evening, sitting at the kitchen table while Nora cooked. Mom inherited it, Nora said. She bought it fair and square from the estate. I know. I just mean, he paused. He was alone here. For 20 years. She thought about that. The 2 bedrooms upstairs, one of which still had a quilt folded on the mattress frame, faded yellow with white stitching. She hadn't moved it. She'd found herself reluctant to, without knowing why. A week after they moved in, she began going through the house more carefully. Not just functionally, as she'd done before, checking for leaks and drafts, but attentively. She went through closets and looked at what remained. The previous estate sale had cleared most things, but not everything. Corners held forgotten items, shelves kept objects that someone had decided weren't worth the trouble of removing. A row of old hardbound books, botanical illustrations on the spines. A wooden clock that no longer ran. A coffee tin that turned out to contain a folded paper square, A hand-drawn map of the property, she realized, done in careful pencil. The forest marked. Trails marked. And at the tree line, behind the house, a symbol, a small square with an X through it. She brought it to Eli. He spread it on the table under the kitchen light, and they both studied it. "What's this?" He touched the square with the X. "I don't know. A structure, maybe?" He traced the trail from the house to the symbol with his finger. "It's not far." "That's maybe 200 feet into the trees." She looked at it. "We should probably wait until morning." He didn't argue with that. But neither of them slept easily. She lay in her room, the smaller one, under the eave, with the window that looked directly into the woods, and thought about the map. About old Mr. Alderman living here alone for 20 years. About the careful lines of the drawing, the precision of someone who knew this land well and wanted to preserve the knowledge of it. About the fact that the map had been left here at all, when most things had been taken away. She thought about her mother. About the letter, which she'd read 3 times now. About the sentence that kept returning to her. "I think I wanted you to have somewhere to land." She had thought at first that this was simply love, which it was. But lying in the dark, listening to the forest, she began to sense that there might be more to it. That her mother had chosen this particular property for a reason, not just any low-priced rural land. That something about it had spoken to her, and that whatever was marked on that map with an X had not been there by accident. They went in the morning. The forest behind the house was dense but not impassable. Someone had cleared a narrow path years ago, and though it had grown in at the edges, the line of it was still readable. The ground underfoot was soft with fallen leaves, and the light came through the canopy in long thin angles, the way autumn light does when it knows its time is running short. Eli led, holding the map. Nora followed, hands in her jacket pockets. Neither of them spoke. Around them, the forest was quiet except for the movement of small things. A bird somewhere in the upper branches, the sound of wind finding gaps in the leaves. They found it at approximately the spot the map indicated. A structure of sorts. A timber and stone surround set into a slight depression in the ground, covered over with decades of leaf fall and the creeping advance of moss. A wooden handle protruded from the center of what was, Nora realized slowly, a hinged door. Horizontal. A cellar door, she thought at first, but the proportions were wrong. Too small. Too thick. Eli crouched down and cleared away leaves with his hands. The door was set in a square stone frame. The stone itself fitted carefully. Old work. Patient work. "A vault," he said quietly. She got down beside him. Together they cleared the rest of the debris, not frantically, but slowly, as if they understood that speed would be wrong here. When the frame was clear, Eli tried the handle. It didn't move. Not rusted shut, locked. A keyhole, she saw, in the wood of the door itself. They looked at each other. "The folder," Nora said. They walked back to the house. In the folder of documents their mother had kept, Nora had assumed the small envelope stapled to the inside cover contained only the house key. She'd taken the house key from it and not looked further. Now she opened the envelope again and turned it over in her palm. 2 keys. She had noticed only one. The second was smaller than the house key, darker, with a different cut. She held it up in the kitchen light. Eli said nothing. They both understood. They went back to the forest. The key fit. The lock turned stiffly, but it turned, and the door lifted on its hinge with a sound like a long breath released. Below was a short wooden staircase, dry, the air inside cool and undisturbed. Nora went first. The vault beneath was stone-lined, roughly 6 feet square, low-ceilinged. A battery lantern sat on a wooden shelf, old but functional, and it came to life when she pressed its switch, which surprised her until she realized it was the kind designed to last years without use. Someone had prepared this space to be found. Not immediately. Eventually. On a central wooden table sat 4 items. A metal document box, locked, with a combination dial. A smaller wooden box, unlocked, containing a collection of photographs. A canvas bag that rustled when she moved it, paper inside. And a letter, this one in a hand she didn't recognize, addressed not to her or Eli but to whoever Claire brought here. She stood very still for a moment. Then she picked up the letter. It had been written by Harold Alderman. She read at the bottom, the man who had owned this house. The man who had lived here alone. The letter was dated 4 years ago, 2 years before his death, 2 years before the estate's sale. He had known her mother. Not well, but meaningfully. Claire had responded to the estate sale listing with a letter of her own, an unusual thing, explaining who she was, and why she wanted the property. She had told him about her children, about the diagnosis, about wanting to find something that would hold them after she couldn't. Harold had been moved by the letter. He had chosen to sell to her instead of to the other bidders, several of whom had offered more. In his letter, he wrote, "I had no children. This house held everything I ever understood about living with patients, and without much company. I built that vault in 1987 for reasons that seemed important then, and may seem strange now. I kept things there I thought might matter to someone someday. I didn't know to whom. Your mother knew, I think, before she finished reading my response to her letter, because she wrote back and said, 'Leave what's there. Whatever it is. Leave it.'" The document box, the combination for which Harold had written in his letter, the year he built the vault, 1987, contained legal papers. A secondary deed addendum. A small account in a county bank, held in the property's name, established by Harold and funded over 20 years with modest but consistent deposits. Not a fortune, but substantial, enough to repair the house properly, enough to give them time. A note in the paperwork said only, "For the house's next life." The photographs in the wooden box were of the property across the decades. The house in summer, in snow, in mud season, young and new, and then aging slowly the way good things do. They were records of a life lived here. She understood that Harold had wanted someone to have them, to know the house's history, to carry it forward rather than discard it. The canvas bag held seeds. Dozens of labeled envelopes, native species, local forest plants, documented in a small notebook tucked inside. Someone's life's work of attention to a piece of ground. Nora sat on the floor of the vault with Harold's letter in her hands, and said nothing for a long time. Eli sat beside her. The lantern made a warm circle of light around them. Above, through the vault door, she could see the canopy of the forest, the pale October sky between the branches. "Mom knew," Eli said eventually. "She knew something was here. She didn't know exactly, but she knew there was more to this place than the price." He was quiet. "She trusted a stranger's letter. She trusted her instinct about a stranger's letter." Nora folded Harold's letter carefully along its original creases. "That sounds more like her." She thought about her mother sitting at the kitchen table on Garfield Street, reading Harold Alderman's response, and feeling something shift. The certainty of it. The calm, pragmatic love of it, buying a house with the last of the insurance money, adding her children's names to a deed, leaving the key with instructions in a box labeled for later. Not dramatic. Not explained. Just done, the way Claire did things. Quietly, and thoroughly, and with a faith that the right moment would eventually make everything clear. November came, and then the first proper cold. Nora and Eli worked on the house on weekends and evenings, using the account Harold had left, slowly, room by room, never rushing. They kept a list on the kitchen wall, items checked off in order of need. The heating system first. The kitchen fixtures. The porch. The windows. Eli planted some of Harold's seeds along the south side of the house before the ground froze, following the notebook's instructions with the same quiet carefulness he brought to everything. He didn't say much about it. He just did it. Nora watched him from the kitchen window sometimes, crouched over the garden bed in his heavy jacket, and felt something she couldn't quite name, something between sorrow and gratitude, which she was learning were not always as different as she thought. She kept the photographs from the vault in a shallow wooden tray on the mantelpiece above the stone fireplace. Harold's house at every age. She looked at them sometimes in the evenings, when the fire was going and Eli was reading, and the forest outside the windows was dark and quiet. A person could spend 20 years alone somewhere, and still leave it full of intention. That was not a small thing. She started writing. Not a journal exactly, more like notes. About the house, about the repairs, about the forest. About what it felt like to be 22 and standing in a room your mother bought for you with money your father had left, filtered through the quiet generosity of a man you never met. In a forest that had been waiting with perfect patience for any of this to happen. She wrote because it felt necessary to record the shape of something this specific. She didn't know who would eventually read it or whether anyone would, but the impulse was the same as Harold's impulse had been, she thought. You preserve what mattered, against the eventuality of being gone. Her mother had understood this without being able to say it. Claire had understood that love sometimes has to work in advance, has to set things in motion before the moment of need arrives, because the moment of need doesn't announce itself. It arrives like a notice on a Tuesday. It arrives without warning. And what you prepared, quietly, privately, without explanation, is what determines whether the people you love have anywhere to stand. Nora thought about the apartment on Garfield Street. The fogged kitchen window. The notice she'd held against her chest. She had thought that morning that she was being pushed out, that the world was simply indifferent, that she and Eli were facing something bleak together. And she had been right about the loss of it. She didn't want to romanticize that. Being pushed out of the only home they'd known since their mother died was a real and painful thing, and she didn't need it to become meaningful to excuse it. But she also thought now, it had started the chain. The 30 days had sent her to the storage unit. The storage unit had given her the box. The box had given her the letter, the photograph, the key, the deed. The deed had brought them here. And here had given them Harold's vault, and Harold's trust. And the evidence of her mother's forward-thinking love, a love that had been operating quietly in the background of their lives for years before they even knew to look for it. Forced out? Yes. And delivered. Those two things could exist at the same time. She had learned that. You could be genuinely displaced and also quietly held. You could grieve a loss and also receive a gift through it. The world was not either cruel or kind. It was both, tangled together, and the people who loved you most left threads you could find if you were patient enough to look. One evening in early December, she and Eli built a fire in the stone fireplace and sat in front of it on the old wooden floor, the good oak floor that had held this room through every season for decades, and didn't talk much. Which was fine. Eli had a cup of coffee. She had one of the botanical books from the shelf she'd eventually read cover to cover by then, identifying the plants Harold had catalogued. Outside, the snow that had been threatening all day had finally decided to fall. She looked at the photographs on the mantelpiece. The house and its different lives. She thought, we are the house's next life. Not in the sense of ownership. Not in the narrow, legal sense of a deed with their names on it. But in the sense that something had been passed to them, a way of living in a place carefully, attending to it, letting it be more than walls and roof. Harold had lived here alone for 20 years and understood things about patience and persistence that she was only beginning to learn. Her mother had bought this understanding sight unseen, had trusted a stranger's letter, and her own instinct had given her children a place to land before they knew they'd need one. These were not small acts. They looked small from the outside. They looked like a real estate transaction, a filing of documents, a locked door in a forest floor. But they were, she understood now, the full weight of love, which rarely announces itself, which works ahead of you, which you only recognize when you arrive at the place it prepared. The snow fell past the window in steady silence. She did not need the house to be more than it was. She did not need the story to be neater than it had been, the path straighter, the arrival less jagged. She needed only to understand that the people who loved her had been paying attention, even when she didn't know they were watching. Even when she couldn't see the ground they were laying beneath her. Even when it looked, from the outside, like being pushed out into nothing. Even then.